Hello and welcome back to the Property Investors Handbook podcast series. I'm your host, Adam Bell, and of course we've got Colleen Sutherland from Sutherland's Property Management Group here with us again. Welcome, Colleen.
Thank you so much, Adam.
Fantastic. So today, another really interesting topic when it comes to landlords and tenants, and that's pets. So the first question I've got, can a landlord decide whether or not they're going to allow tenants to have a pet, just to say yes or no?
No.
No.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have pets in your property. But no, the tenant is allowed to ask and make application, and the landlord is allowed to refuse, but the refusal must be on reasonable grounds.
So they can't just say, I don't want pets in the house.
No, but if the property is not suitable for a pet, then that is cause for grounds to say no. But yeah, it has to be considered, and then refusal or approval needs to be in writing. And you've got a time limit on that too. You've got 14 days. And if you don't respond in 14 days, it can be assumed that the tenant is allowed to keep the pet. It's called a tacit agreement.
Okay, interesting. Could I put it to you this way? If a tenant really didn't want pets in their property, would there always be a way for them to find a way to prove what you were just saying, that give that reason within the law to have it happen, to have the no pets there?
Yeah, so I'm going to assume that you meant landlord because
Yes.
you said tenant.
I did mean tenant.
So what happened on the 1st of October 2022 was legislation changed to allow renting with pets. There is structure around that. It's all new, and I do have some guidelines here. But there is an option to say no if there is the reasonable grounds to refuse. So you have to go through those guidelines to say, yes, you can, no, you can't. But it's not necessarily now that the landlord doesn't want a pet because I'm going to move back in 12 months' time and I can't have cat hair because I'm allergic.
Right.
Legislation doesn't
allow
for allergies. So, and I know that sounds trivial, but for a person who is allergic to animals, then that does cause quite a problem.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So that would be an application to QCAT.
Okay. So what are the general clauses in a tenancy agreement that do pertain to a tenant's responsibility about having pets?
Much of that would come around pet damage. So pet damage is not considered fair wear and tear. So if the pet has chewed the architraves or scratched the door or dug up the garden, all that sort of stuff is not considered fair wear and tear. That is pet damage, and that has to be repaired. The other areas would be the property must be professionally fumigated and professionally carpet cleaned if there's carpets on the floor. So there is guidelines around what the tenant needs to do when their responsibilities by having a pet. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Can you elaborate on the process and conditions a tenant has to meet when they want to get a pet during the tenancy?
Yeah, so I've got some notes here, only again because it's so new that and there's so much to it that I've just got some notes here. But the tenant must seek permission to have the pet before they can have the pet on the property. So if during the application process you're a new tenant and you're moving in and here's my dog, you write it all down and we go through that process at the time. But if you live at the property and you go, I'm going to get a dog, then you need to make application and be approved before you can bring the pet onto the property. If you've got the pet before approval is given, that's grounds for a breach notice, and then that's a whole different set of rules.
Sure.
But you seek, and then the landlord can refuse, but needs to give permission, identify reasonable grounds within 14 days, and then the landlord's consent has to be in writing, and then the tenant will sign an agreement as to what they're going to agree on to have the pet on the premises. Cats are, next to nothing other than their urine in the carpet.
Yep.
Snakes is another issue altogether. Again, most snakes need a permit.
Yep.
And if you have a permit, yes. If you don't have a permit and you've just brought the snake from the last property, no, it'll be a refusal. There's a difference between a working animal and a domestic animal. So a working animal, we can't refuse. A landlord cannot refuse that unless the property is not suitable, of course.
Yep.
But if you've got an animal that you take to work, whether it's a police dog, security dog, or, for the blind, or a comfort dog, how they've got them now for mental health.
Sure.
They'll all have a permit, but you as the tenant need to determine that the property is suitable for the animal. So is it too small? Does it have a yard? Is the yard fenced? All that sort of thing.
Sure. So you're saying that these working animals, that unless you can prove that the property is not suitable to house them, that a landlord must accept.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But if you're in a unit and you have a German Shepherd for your security, body corporate might say no pets. So you need to get a copy of the bylaws, and in there, if it says yes, pets permitted, it'll have the size that you're allowed to have, and it'll have the weight and the that sort of thing.
So body corporate laws supersede the tenancy laws
if you're going into a unit.
Sure.
Yeah. So what was happening was body corporate do allow pets mostly, but it used to only apply to owner occupiers and didn't apply to tenants. But now it's applying to both.
Sure.
Yeah. So the body corporate need to catch up.
You mentioned before that any pet damage isn't wear and tear and that needs to be addressed by the tenant. Yep. and fixed and paid for. Can a landlord get a pet bond?
No. In Queensland, a pet bond is not allowed.
Okay.
And neither, if you're there during the tenancy and you're applying for a pet, and the landlord will say yes, but he's got to pay an extra $50 a week. Can't do that either.
Can't do that.
No.
So this is what all the legislation changes have come in for, I imagine.
A lot of it has already been in. However, the government has put a structure around that to make it a little bit more legislated, that you can't contradict this legislation, or you shouldn't contradict the legislation. People push the envelope and do, and you can either negotiate it to work or negotiate it out.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So references. Do you as property managers suggest, or is it done as standard practice where you get references for pets as you do for the tenants themselves?
You can. So if you're applying for a property and have a tenant have an animal at the same time, they'll come with a reference. So we'll either ask the previous agent, or that type of a dog has this type of a personality. So, like the little tiny dogs.
Sure.
Some of them can be all cutesy and stuff, but some of them can just bark and bark and bark. So that is against legislation, that it's going to cause disturbance to the neighbouring properties, and it may not be allowed.
Sure. So you touched on this before, but can a landlord put any sort of restrictions on size or breed or type of animal that a tenant can have?
No, not necessarily. But funny, I've just come up with the notes of reasonable grounds for the refusal of a pet.
Go through a few of those with us.
Yeah, so exceeds a reasonable number of animals kept at the property. So you've already got one and you want another one, or you want another two. It'll come under council regulations. It'll come under, all sorts of other areas as well, and, dog breeders and that sort of thing. The premises is unsuitable due to the lack of appropriate fencing, open spaces, and that it may not be kept in a humane manner.
Right.
Yeah. So we do have ones where the dog breeders breed, and you've got far too many animals at the property. They're in cages.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah. So, and that's when it gets ugly. It's likely to cause damage that could not practicably be repaired for the cost less than the bond amount.
Right.
Yeah. So it's chewed all the door frames, and all the door frames have to be replaced. So that can be quite costly.
Yep.
It's a risk to health and safety of a person. So you know how there is some animals that are aggressive and known to attack children or stuff like that. He can refuse the pet there. It contravenes a law or a body corporate bylaw. So we touched on the body corporate bylaws where it's got to be written in there that they can have a pet. But a law could be that there is no pets allowed because of the wildlife.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so we have to consider that. The animal is not considered a pet, which could mean a lizard or something that you don't normally have as a domestic animal.
Sure, yep. A monkey?
Yeah, well, it could be a monkey, yes, and knowing that you can't have a monkey or a rabbit, things like that. And then where the landlord has refused, the tenant doesn't have to agree to the reasonable grounds, but that's where it comes into the tenant then has to make an application to the tribunal to have the matter heard before an adjudicator. It's a non-urgent matter, so it could take a while to be heard, but then that adjudicator's decision's final.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hey, have you ever gone to a routine inspection and found an animal that I'm sure you have, and I'd love to hear the stories that obviously isn't on the tenancy agreement, or B, evidence to suggest there's an animal.
It's usually evidence.
I would imagine so.
Yeah, yeah.
What's this dog hair doing here?
Or the dog feces in the backyard. So they've cleaned up all the bowls and the blankets and stuff and left the poop out the backyard. So we often get, that's not my dog. I'm looking after it for my mother, my brother, my somebody.
Is that allowed? That's an interesting question.
No.
So not even for a night?
It's not allowed, but, people do.
Be fair and reasonable.
So once it's discovered and action is taken, then it's the tenant's responsibility to, rectify that breach. So if you've got an animal there and it is yours and you haven't sought approval, then that's when we can breach you and to get rid of the animal. You can't apply for it after the fact.
Sure.
Yeah.
And if being a property manager for over 30 years, tell me a time when you've gone and seen what's the worst damage you've seen from animals.
The worst,
you would have seen a bit in your time, I would imagine.
Yeah, yes. One of the worst, like I mentioned, is the chewing that they do. They chew. Some dogs just chew everything, or cats with their claws, and if they don't have one of those
scratching poles,
they will scratch the carpet. So we've had to replace carpet. And the chewing of the dog on the bottoms of the doors, on the architraves, that sort of thing. And don't get me wrong, I never used to be a pet person, but my son got a dog and I just love it. So I can understand what how people go through that torment of you've got to get rid of your dog. But the damage that they do in the yards, some of them, and there are dogs that don't dig, and don't worry, but there are dogs that just dig, and they dig everything. Or if you're not walking your dog and you've got the pet runs, those they've no more grass there.
Yep.
Then that is considered pet damage, and you do have to fix that now.
Right.
Before you didn't have to, but now you do.
Yep.
So
what recourse do landlords have if a tenant if a pet does cause significant damage?
Well, it is a bond claim if the tenant doesn't rectify the damage. So the tenant's responsible for rectifying it. If they don't, they have to pay for the cost of rectifying. What I would recommend to a tenant is to take out an insurance over the rental property that will cover you for when you can't pay the rent and that sort of thing. But it can also cover you for damage, for accidental damage by you or the pet. So that would probably be my best advice for a tenant to cover themselves so that you're not having to fork out for all the repairs.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know there were insurance policies
Renters
like that?
insurance, it's called. Yeah.
Wow, you learned something. I think we've got another episode on that one at some particular point because, that would be especially if you're not that responsible.
Yeah. Or, it's like any insurance that you can make a claim when you can't afford to pay or, I'm covered for that, I'll just claim that on insurance.
Sure.
Yeah. But the landlord has an insurance too. But again, that's another whole podcast.
This comes back again to education mitigating the risk here, and again you've shown how you, Colleen, and Sutherland's property management, you educate both sides here, the tenant about their responsibilities and how to manage the pet, and you're doing it with the landlord on whether about having the pet and how you would manage it, and again it just worth your weight in gold having a fantastic agency looking after all this for both sides.
What I've got, renting with pets now has become quite a whole subject in itself. And I've got a presentation that I'm happy to share about more in depth of what's a working animal, what's a domestic animal, what the tenants can do if they've been refused to have a pet, how the landlord can refuse a pet, legal options. So I've got a presentation if anybody wanted to.
Fantastic.
And I'm happy to share that because it sort of helps both parties. And then if one of my major mottos is that education is the most cost-effective form of risk mitigation. So if I can help educate the landlord or the tenant around pets, happy to do that, and I'm happy to pass that on.
Fantastic. Excellent. Well, look, that's been incredibly insightful. I didn't realise there'd been so many changes and that it is, again, a bit of a minefield on knowing all of the right bits and pieces to do with it. So, again, another fantastic reason to have a property manager on board whose job it is to know all that and help both parties through it.
Yes.
Exactly. So, again, where can people get in touch with you, Colleen? Where can they get that that report that you've done?
So you can Google me on Sutherland's Property Management Group, or my website is spmg.com.au. I do have a little chatbot there, so if you send a message via that and say, can I have that link to the YouTube, it's on YouTube. So if you want a link, I'm happy to send a link and you can have a look at it yourself.
Fantastic. Excellent. Well, look, we put this podcast out weekly. We're due to drop another episode next Thursday between 4 and 6. Next week, we are looking at fixed term and periodic tenancies, which will be another really interesting topic for us to pull apart. So once again, thanks for coming in and look forward to talking to you then.
Great. Thanks, Adam.